Welcome to the Adapting Places podcast. I'm just going to continue a series of talks that are mirroring my PhD in decision making under uncertainty, with a focus on some of the data that I'm collecting at the moment. I've had a couple of exciting interviews, but also some weird dreams as I'm spending a lot of time analyzing. Oh, it's really hilarious. I had this dream of me being somewhere, felt like in America, but I know it was inspired by the movie The Big Short. If you haven't seen it, it's about how the economic crash of 2008 happened. It's kind of a ritual movie for me and my wife. We watch it very often as a little reminder. I remember in my dream, it was really funny. So I was being taken around by someone that was like a fancy tour guide type. And we were in a really fancy pool, and there was alcohol and cigars. There was definitely a party. And at one point I asked him, okay, so what do you do for a living? And then he pointed around the city and said, like this. I'm selling this like a lifestyle to future investors, because the state or the government officials can't do this kind of entertaining themselves. They hire someone that they trust to do this kind of thing. So I just have to do it, entertain people and sell them a lifestyle. And I maybe have been suppressing this view for a while because I have been involved deeply in place branding, and I started with a critical view because it does seem like we're selling people's lives, our own lives, to investors when we create these, images of cities and countries that are too polished. But also, obviously, I understand you can't say they're not desirable. I've been involved in trying to do a vision for a place. Felt good, really felt good. Even though you realize that's probably not the right approach. But it was interesting that's still there for me, to be critical of what's going on, because I know the archetype of the person that I was imagining there was from the Big Short, the movie, because in one scene there's one of the main guys is talking to he's not a hedge fund manager, he's a manager of I think it might be a hedge fund, but that invests specifically on these CDOs. As much as I remember what a CDO is, it was just basically gambling on other people not paying off their debts, basically, and rippling that out across the economy. And there was that person that was responsible for selling those kind of investments to people, while at the same time packaging them as an investment to someone else. And they kind of knew what was happening, but they were very well reimbursed. They were living a good lifestyle, but also not really following through that when things go tits up, they're the first people that are gonna bite it as well. So I know that's probably what I was thinking about. I know that's not what people are intending to do, but are we in some ways in our practice of promoting and marketing and branding places doing this? Because it's dangerous. We can drink our own bootleg, our own dreams, buy them. So starting with that optimistic dream, I'm going to talk about human nature, which I don't think is like that, because I've kind of talked about the fundamental nature of reality, which I think is very uncertain. I've talked about how we can know it, and kind of the distinction between two schools of thought on how to study people. And so these two being the kind of the heuristics and biases. Oh, my dog is... Oreo, come here, boy. Yes, good boy. Yes, Oreo, you've got yourself a cameo. So I've outlined the two perspectives. So the heuristics and biases, focusing a lot on bias and the flaws of decision making that people have in studying the world, and then the other one that highlights the focus on understanding how specifically people do that studying, even though it has a bias, of course. Much like any tools that we might use to know reality, be they more sophisticated or more heuristic like, more rules of thumb like, they will have a bias, but still study them in detail because then maybe there's something to be learned from that. So I've covered this often. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think that's why I've leaned in my PhD research onto the more, well, I'll call it cognitive and evolutionary perspective rather than the more behavioral one. So behavior is, observing people from the outside, how they act, because that's more informative than what they think. In some ways, that's kind of more on the heuristics and biases side. And that has a bigger tradition in behavioral economics, but more and more, I think the other one about studying how people make decisions I think it's useful. It's found its way very easily in computer science, and all of the fancy discussions about algorithms. Well, I think people's rules of thumb, if you ask them in detail what they do, they might have some summaries that they might tell you, which might sound trivial, but when you ask them in detail how they work, they're very much similar to algorithms, but obviously not as clearly and explicitly held in our minds, because if you always have to recall the full thing, well, what's the point of having this thinking? It's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that the whole point of having these shortcuts is so that you don't have to think about it every time. You've summarized it more and more, and this is speculative because it's not my area, but I've heard other people talk about this, where you're able to also probably transfer some of these learned behaviors into, out of your conscious awareness, wherever it goes into the brain. I'm not a specialist in that. I don't even want to get into that discussion because I'm definitely going to make mistakes. Super exciting for me because somehow it grounds things. But I don't think it's for me to comment on that, but it's definitely related to learning in some way. And specifically from the data that I've been getting, it's really interesting when I walk people through their life history of where they've lived. And I've been fascinated by how vividly people remember places, and they talk about how they can't be separated from their personal experiences, which from literature and geography is kind of known. That's why I even chose to study people's decisions related to place, because place feels very trivial. When people talk about it, it's one of the first three things you talk to people about when you're getting to know them. Hi, at the party, you just say, hi, I'm so and so from wherever. Used to be even in people's names. Leonardo da Vinci was from Da Vinci, and so it's not a touchy topic, and yet it's so related to the self that once you talk to people about place, they really open up about their own thinking. So in my interviews, I do find in an hour and a half, the first half an hour is always, I'm always concerned, like, are we gonna get to talk about the real stuff I'm interested in? And then people just open up, because once you talk about place, how they perceive it, you just start really getting to know them very well, and then it's easy to pinpoint the big moments, because a lot of times that interesting phenomenon of people really remember the place around them as well when they've had these big moments of their life. Like, for example, I literally had one of the participants talk about an experience of remembering 9/11, the World Trade Center terrorist attack, and how after that he knew he needed to move away, and that meant they needed to make a decision to move away because that could happen. And you could think straight away, you know, there's a lot of the behavior economics literature around how irrational that would be because of the stats. But the process of how then he went about making the decision, it was very much using the head, doing pros and cons list and discussing over the long term with his wife. And I explicitly even asked, you know, was there written pros and cons list, because that's very much a kind of, you know, it's considered more rational. I do ask people if they think they made rational decisions. In that case, I got the rule of thumb from that participant that was really interesting. You know, just follow your heart and not your head. And that sounds very trivial, right? Like when you hear it, it's like, oh. But being talked through the process of what that means, and the example of, you know, the heart is being able to work things that, you know, you find naturally interesting, or you have this sense of what needs to happen, but then always using your head to take time and make a decision. And one of the things that was recommended was also to never make a decision while in a state of crisis. And in the behavioral economics literature, that is known as tilt. It's been a very useful thing for me to learn over the years personally, not to make decisions while emotionally in tilt. I've even crystallized it with my wife. We use that, you know, when someone's in tilt, we tell each other, and then it's almost like I tend to say, get off my back, I'm in tilt mode. And that's been very helpful. So one of the things that, so the clear thing I'm talking about here is the difference between a concept and a process. So people's concepts of what they call their rules of thumb, if you don't have the patience to ask them what they mean of the process that they're going to go through, then they might sound a bit like cliches, because they might mean a different thing than the traditional thing, but that's like the entry point that they consider you might know of. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about with my data. And another interesting thing that I wanted to mention that just went out of my head. Let me just check my notes. I actually did make some notes as reminders for this. Oh, yeah. Yes. So I've been thinking about how generalizable these rules of thumb are. Could you apply them to a different setting? Because that's I think, at the surface level, the usefulness to these generalizations, because you have a process that worked in a certain domain. So in choosing a place, then can you lift it and shift it and use it to choose a job, choose whatever. And I would have to really compare all of the rules of thumb that people have talked to me about to then see if there is a common structure. That's something that's suggested in the literature, but I'll need to see if there is a commonality and divergence in specific ways in the rules of thumb that people talk about. But it's a bloody pleasant experience doing these kind of interviews, I have to say, compared to, I actually do a very similar thing in my day job where I ask people about their, what I would call them rules of thumb as well, but they tend to be about trivial things. You know, how do you print out a PDF? You know, because people find that they shouldn't be giving me all the detail, but when you need to program new software, it's actually quite crucial to know the detail, because then you're kind of anticipating certain problems. So doing it at a more general level and talking about people's strive for finding a good place to live in. It's more interesting because you get a lot of interesting detail. And I do hope that some of that interesting detail as well will be a part of the contribution, even though I'm mostly interested in decision making. By now I have so many different cities mentioned. I put everything that was mentioned on a map. I've only got some gaps around Africa, the south of South America, the Russia, bit in the Central Asia with the different stands, Eastern Europe actually, where I'm from originally. But it's interesting. I've got, from 11 people, I've had such a breadth of experience of where they've lived and also places that they think about. So that's quite interesting. What's the imagination they have for places they haven't visited, and how this comes about is an interesting question for place branding rather than decision making. And the descriptions that people have of place, I've been starting to, I've created these little percepts, so chunks. So every chunk of a mention of a place, whether it's going to be related to the physical location, anything to do with the locale, how people tend to go about their business there, or any feeling related to a place, any sense of place, and personal experience as well in these places. So I've tried to split them out into these kind of, location, locale, sense of place, and personal experience while I was analyzing. And up until now, it's just not proved easy. So it's definitely an enforced categorization. I mean, in the geography literature, these things are talked about as intertwined and emergent, that at a certain location you get people that mingle, and then there is a sense of place that emerges. So it's interesting to see that trying to almost disprove it, because I almost thought that these could be different percepts, different types of, perceptual data almost that people get. And if I could distinguish them. Oreo, come on, you're too intense. That's it, good boy. So trying to split them out, it's not a naturally occurring category. It was definitely me trying to force it. And thinking about it now, it makes me really feel comfortable with qualitative analysis, because I used to think that it would be easy to force things a certain way, but it's actually quite difficult. Like, you kind of know when you're wishing the data go a certain way, and it's nice to think about how, whatever you're looking at, the data is starting to lead you. And for me, spending 4 years of literature review and only now having like real data, I was almost scared that I'll keep talking about the literature and not through my data, which well, it would be armchair kind of science, right? But the data just finds its way through me, because it's people that I've spoken to. I know them, I remember their stories, and now it's going to be about getting more of them and finding a way to tell the story that's entertaining, because I mean, somebody has to read this, even if it's going to be just a few reviewers. And the chunking up into papers and chapters of writing would be easier, but the full thing, I need to find a way to bring out the key themes that have come out, but also not abstract away from humans, because something happens when we abstract away from people too much these days. I see it in the way our technology gets made, in the way that economics and certain disciplines become dehumanizing because they've abstracted too much, and you lose the touch between your original data and the theory. So I don't want to do that, but it's I still don't know how to do this exactly, but it's an interesting challenge. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about on this episode, but it was supposed to be more around human nature. Did I talk about that? Because I look at human nature as through the lens of decision making, and maybe for me to talk about anything more abstract would be dangerous. It would be too out of the scope of what I've got, actually. I mean, I've been reading a lot of philosophy, obviously, but I think, yeah, it's not for me to be the expert in that. It's just exciting reading because I find it actually quite practical. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I've got another 5 interviews booked in over the next few days, so I'll have a lot more to talk about and share.